Chapter 8, Reflection, What We All Suspected, 400 to 500 words. Return to the theme. We always suspected Annie Hall wasn't fiction. It was confession. The story of Keaton and Allen is about two souls who built each other artistically, even when love faded. Woody's revelation confirms what fans long sensed. She wasn't just his muse. She was his mirror and a reflective line. In every Woody Allen film that searches for love and meaning, Diane Keaton's laughter still echoes. Diane Keaton was born on January 5, 1946, in Los Angeles, California, a city that would one day immortalize her name. Her father, Jack Hall, was a real estate broker and occasional photographer. Her mother, Dorothy, a homemaker with a creative spirit who once won a Mrs. Los Angeles pageant. From her mother, Diane inherited a fascination with self-expression, the idea that personality could be a performance all its own. The Keaton household was warm, curious, and a little unconventional. Creativity wasn't a luxury. It was a way of life. As a child, Diane was drawn to the stage long before she ever dreamed of Hollywood. She loved to perform, to make people laugh, to try on personas like costumes. When other girls her age idolized Marilyn Monroe, Diane fell under the spell of Katharine Hepburn, the quick-tongued, trouser-wearing trailblazer who defied the Hollywood mold. Hepburn represented everything Diane wanted to be: independent, articulate, unapologetically herself. Years later, Diane would admit that watching Hepburn and Alice Adams changed her forever. She didn't want to just act. She wanted to be someone who challenged the rules. After graduating from high school, Keaton studied drama at Santa Ana College and later transferred to the neighborhood playhouse in New York City, immersing herself in the city's electric theater scene. New York in the late 60s was alive with protest, art, and reinvention, and Diane fit right in. Her first big break came in 1968, when she joined the original Broadway cast of Hair, the counterculture musical that shocked audiences with its rebellious spirit and frank celebration of freedom. She famously refused to appear nude, setting her apart even among rebels, a decision that perfectly captured her paradoxical charm. Bold, yet modest, daring, yet distinctly her own. The exposure from Hair led to her first film roles. In 1970, she appeared in Lovers and Other Strangers, a warm, witty romantic comedy that hinted at her future as the queen of offbeat charm. But it wasn't until 2 years later that fate intervened in a way that would define both her career and her heart. In 1972, Diane auditioned for a Broadway play written by a rising New York comedian and filmmaker named Woody Allen. Play it again, Sam. The chemistry between them was instant. Woody, the neurotic, self-deprecating intellectual with a rapid-fire wit, met Diane, the unpredictable California dreamer who never tried to impress anyone. Together, they created something electric. The play became a hit, running for more than 450 performances, and their connection spilled beyond the stage. They began dating, quietly at first, but everyone who knew them sensed that this was more than a romance. It was a start in artistic symbiosis. For Diane, Woody represented everything unfamiliar yet irresistible. The intellectual humor of the East Coast, the neurotic poetry of New York life. For Woody, Diane was something Hollywood rarely produced: real, unfiltered, and fearlessly unique. She didn't fit the mold of a traditional leading lady, and he loved her all the more for it. That meeting in Play Again, Sam was more than a turning point. It was a spark that lit a creative fire lasting over 5 decades. From that moment on, Diane Keaton was no longer just a young actress looking for a role. She had found her voice, her mirror, and a collaborator who would help her become an icon. Woody Allen was born Alan Stewart Konigsberg on December 1st, 1935, in Brooklyn, New York, a world away from Diane Keaton's sunny Los Angeles upbringing. He grew up in a modest Jewish family, the son of Nettie, a bookkeeper, and Martin, a jewelry engraver and cab driver. From the beginning, Woody saw the world through irony. The chaos of family dinners, the noise of the city, and the insecurities of adolescence all became raw material for his humor. At just 15, he began submitting jokes to newspaper columnists, and by the time he was 17, he was earning more from writing one-liners than most adults did at full-time jobs. By his early 20s, Allen had become one of the top comedy writers in New York. He wrote for Your Show of Shows, working under legends like Sid Caesar and Mel Brooks, learning the rhythms of smart, character-driven humor. But Woody's ambition wasn't satisfied behind the scenes. He wanted a voice, his own. So he stepped onto the stage, adopting a persona that would define him. The anxious intellectual, forever caught between self-doubt and existential dread. His stand-up routines, filled with musings about God, death, and awkward relationships, were unlike anything the nightclub circuit had seen. The neurotic antihero had arrived. Hollywood came calling soon after. In the mid-1960s, Allen began writing screenplays and directing his own films, turning his offbeat humor into cinematic form. His early works, Take the Money and Run, 1969, Bananas, 1971, and Sleeper, 1973, were pure comic anarchy, slapstick, absurd, and brilliant. But beneath the laughter, there was always a yearning for something deeper, a search for meaning in the madness. He was a filmmaker learning to balance intellect and emotion, irony and sincerity. And that balance would only come when he met Diane Keaton. When Keaton walked into his life during Play It Again, Sam, something shifted. She wasn't like anyone Woody had ever met. Her timing was instinctive, her presence magnetic, her contradictions endlessly fascinating. She was both glamorous and awkward, confident and self-effacing, a walking paradox that mirrored his own. Woody often said she didn't just act, she reacted. She didn't deliver lines, she lived them. Their chemistry wasn't forced or theatrical. It was something rare and real. Their relationship blossomed in the early 1970s, both on stage and off. They were opposites that fit perfectly. Woody's sharp analytical mind found harmony in Diane's spontaneity and warmth. She brought color to his precision. He gave her structure to shape her playfulness. Friends recalled how inseparable they became, writing together, talking for hours about movies, literature, and the absurdities of life. Their romance was quirky but profound, filled with laughter, shared fears, and mutual respect. When Woody began writing and directing more personal films, Diane became his muse, not just in appearance, but in spirit. She was the emotional truth behind his characters. With her, his filmmaking took a turn away from pure comedy toward introspection. Sleeper and Love and Death showcased not just their on-screen chemistry, but also his growing fascination with her unpredictable soul. She challenged him, made him look inward, made him care about humanity in a way he hadn't before. In many ways, Keaton was a catalyst for Woody Allen's golden age of cinema, the period that would define his legacy. Together, they created stories that captured the beauty and absurdity of modern love, stories that felt more like therapy sessions and scripts. Their relationship blurred the lines between life and art so completely that audiences couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. For Diane, Woody offered not only opportunity but trust. He wrote parts that allowed her to show everything she was: eccentric, brilliant, vulnerable, messy, and real. And for Woody, Diane was proof that emotion could coexist with intellect, that comedy could reveal truth rather than hide it. By the time Annie Hall entered development, their romance had cooled, but their connection had not. They were still tethered by something larger than love, creative dependency, mutual admiration, maybe even soul recognition. Whatever it was, it propelled them into making one of the most defining films in American cinema. Looking back, Woody once said that meeting Diane Keaton changed the way he saw everything. She was unpredictable, he said, and that made her perfect, both for life and for film. In that unpredictability, he found his muse, and together they created not just a partnership, but a cinematic legacy that would outlive them both. When Annie Hall premiered in 1977, no one could predict it would redefine romantic comedy, or become one of the most intimate confessions ever captured on film. Directed and co-written by Woody Allen, starring Diane Keaton as the quirky, luminous Annie Hall opposite Allen's anxious Alvy singer, the movie was more than a story about love. It was a mirror held up to their own relationship, their joys, their breakups, their conversations, their private jokes. What began as a script about a failed romance became, under Woody's direction and Diane's spirit, a cinematic love letter written in real time. By then, their romantic relationship had quietly ended. The intensity that had drawn them together on Play It Again, Sam had mellowed into something more enduring, a friendship laced with affection, nostalgia, and mutual understanding. But emotionally, they were still tethered. Woody, who had built his reputation on neurotic comedy and philosophical musings, found in Diane's energy a reminder of everything unpredictable and pure. She, in turn, still found his mind irresistible. When production began, they were no longer lovers, but there was no mistaking the chemistry that had once burned between them. It was still there, humming just beneath every glance, every line. The film's title character, Annie Hall, wasn't just inspired by Diane Keaton. She was Diane Keaton. Even her name was borrowed from real life. Annie was Diane's childhood nickname, and Hall was her original last name before she adopted her mother's maiden name, Keaton, for the stage. Woody didn't even try to disguise it. He wanted the movie to feel real, because for him, it was her character's distinctive style, oversized men's suits, vests, wide ties, and floppy hats, came directly from Diane's own wardrobe. Costume designer Ruth Morley once recalled that Diane arrived on set wearing her usual mix of masculine and bohemian clothing, and Woody loved it so much that he told everyone, "Let her be herself." That look became one of the most influential fashion moments in film history, and a symbol of Keaton's authenticity. Then there was her voice, halting, spontaneous, full of nervous laughter and half-finished sentences. The now famous line, La Dita, wasn't scripted at all. It was Diane, fumbling charmingly through a moment, trying to fill the silence with something light. But in that tiny, improvised beat, she captured the heart of the film, the beauty of imperfection, the sweetness of someone trying to stay composed in the face of overwhelming emotion. That one phrase, La Dita, became a cultural shorthand for Keaton herself. Whimsical, self-effacing, and unforgettable. The story of Annie Hall is deceptively simple. Boy meets girl. Boy loses girl. Boy remembers girl. But underneath the humor and fragmented storytelling lies a confession, one that blurred fiction and memory. Woody Allen later admitted that the film began as a much broader comedy, originally titled Anhedonia, meaning the inability to feel pleasure. But as he edited, the laughs gave way to something more intimate. What remained was a film about two people who loved deeply, failed gently, and never quite let go. It was their story, retold with tenderness and regret. For Woody, the movie was catharsis. Alvy Singer's insecurities, his obsession with meaning, his inability to sustain love, they were his own. For Diane, it was liberation. Annie Hall was the embodiment of her contradictions. Intelligent but unsure, brave but awkward, free but fragile. Through that character, she gave the world permission to embrace imperfection, to find humor in heartbreak. When Annie Hall was released, it became an instant phenomenon. Critics hailed it as a masterpiece, funny, poignant, and profoundly human. It won 4 Academy Awards: Best Picture, Best Director, Best Original Screenplay, and Best Actress for Diane Keaton. When her name was called that night, she walked the stage in typical Keaton fashion, smiling shyly, her voice trembling with disbelief. She thanked Woody Allen first. It was more than professional courtesy. It was acknowledgement of the bond that had made her career and perhaps shaped her soul. Behind the success, though, there was a quiet ache. Everyone who knew them understood that Annie Hall wasn't just a movie. It was Woody's goodbye, his way of saying everything he hadn't said when they broke up. In his own reflective words later, "That film was my way of writing a love letter to Diane. It's how I remember us." And perhaps that's why the movie feels timeless. Because it wasn't written by a man trying to entertain, but by one trying to understand the woman he lost. Even decades later, when asked about the film, Diane would smile and say, "It's impossible to separate the movie from my life. It's all there." She never denied how much of herself was in Annie Hall, and she never resented it either. She wore that legacy like one of her signature hats, a little tilted, a little ironic, but with unmistakable pride. In the end, Annie Hall became more than their masterpiece. It was their monument, a film that froze a fleeting love in amber, turning a deeply personal story into universal truth. It captured what makes human connection so fragile and so eternal, that even when love fades, its echo can live forever, in memory, in art, and in the spaces between laughter and regret. After Annie Hall, it seemed that Diane Keaton and Woody Allen had reached the pinnacle of what two people could create together. But what followed wasn't an ending, it was an evolution. Their romantic relationship had quietly dissolved before the film even premiered. Yet their connection refused to fade. In the years that followed, they would drift apart in love but remain inseparable in art, drawn to each other's orbit like two planets sharing the same sun. Woody, never one to linger in one emotional state for long, threw himself into his next projects. He directed Interiors, 1978, a somber, introspective drama that marked a sharp turn from his usual comedic tone. And once again, Diane was there, not as a muse this time, but as an actor fully inhabiting his darker world. She played Renata, a poet wrestling with family chaos and creative insecurity, a character so layered and restrained it felt almost like a study of herself. The performance was critically praised, and their collaboration proved that even without romance, they could still create cinematic intimacy of a different kind, the intimacy of trust. Then came Manhattan, 1979, a film that many viewed as Woody's next masterpiece. Although it starred Mariel Hemingway as his youthful love interest, it was Keaton's presence as Mary Wilkie, the sophisticated, self-aware writer, that grounded the film. Watching them together on screen, audiences could still sense that familiar electricity, the shorthand of two people who once finished each other's sentences. By this time, Diane was dating Warren Beatty, her Reds co-star, whose fiery charisma and political passion fascinated her. Woody, meanwhile, had begun what would become a long and complicated partnership with Mia Farrow. Yet no matter where their lives branched, Diane and Woody continued to circle back to each other professionally, as though the universe insisted on keeping their dialogue going. Their paths might have diverged, but neither spoke of the other with anything but affection. In interviews throughout the 1980s, Woody described Keaton with a kind of wistful reverence that he reserved for no one else. "Diane was a great love of my life," he once said, "the only woman who never made me feel judged." That statement revealed a lot about both of them, his lifelong battle with insecurity, and her effortless acceptance of people as they were. She didn't try to fix him or flatter him. She simply understood him, which, for someone like Woody Allen, was the rarest form of love. Keaton, for a part, always spoke of Woody with the same mixture of admiration and gentle melancholy. She once called him the funniest, smartest, saddest man I've ever known, a sentence that summed up their entire relationship in one breath. Even years later, she would tell interviewers that there was always a piece of her that loved him, not romantically perhaps, but existentially. They had seen each other's best and worst moments and still chosen to stay connected. That, she seemed to imply, was its own kind of devotion. When they weren't working together, they were writing letters or calling, sometimes going months without talking, then picking up as if no time had passed. Neither ever spoke of jealousy, even when the other was involved with someone new. Woody, ever private about his emotions, once joked that Diane ruined me for other women. She was too perfect in her imperfections. Diane would laugh when she heard that, saying, "He's impossible and irresistible, but mostly impossible." Their friendship became one of Hollywood's most enduring mysteries, a bond that outlived romance, fame, and even scandal. It was as if Annie Hall had sealed them in amber, preserving the essence of their connection forever. They were no longer lovers, but their affection had matured into something deeper, more lasting, an unspoken acknowledgement that what they had was once in a lifetime. In an industry where relationships often vanish as quickly as they begin, Woody and Diane managed to keep theirs alive. Not through constant contact, but through unwavering respect and the quiet recognition that neither had ever truly left the other. They may have moved on in life, but in spirit, they were still walking side by side to that black and white New York skyline. Two souls bound by laughter, history, and a love that never really needed an ending. Through the 1980s and 1990s, the paths of Diane Keaton and Woody Allen began to drift further apart. Not out of bitterness, but because life itself pulled them in different directions. The artistic synergy that once defined them gave way to individual pursuits. Each moved deeper into their own world, yet no matter how far their careers diverged, a thread of loyalty, invisible but unbreakable, continued to connect them. For Woody Allen, the 1980s began as a creative high point. He followed Manhattan with a string of films that cemented his reputation as one of the most distinct voices in American cinema. Zelig, 1983, Broadway Danny Rose, 1984, The Purple Rose of Cairo, 1985, Hannah and Her Sisters, 1986, and Crimes and Misdemeanors, 1989. His blend of humor, philosophy, and self-doubt had become his signature. But behind the accolades, Allen's personal life grew increasingly complicated. His long partnership with actress Mia Farrow, who appeared in many of his films, became both artistically fruitful and personally fraught. Their relationship ended in the early 1990s amid scandal and bitter public controversy that would haunt him for decades. The fallout was enormous, his reputation took a hit, Hollywood divided sharply, and former allies distanced themselves. Diane Keaton, meanwhile, had been steadily carving out her own identity, independent of Woody's cinematic shadow. She had already proven her range in Reds, 1981, the sweeping historical drama directed by Warren Beatty, for which she earned an Academy Award nomination. But the 1980s also saw her explore lighter roles, romantic comedies like Baby Boom, 1987, where she portrayed a career woman thrust into unexpected motherhood, capturing both the humor and vulnerability of modern womanhood. Audiences loved her. She had become America's sophisticated every woman, neurotic but relatable, eccentric but deeply human. By the 1990s, Keaton was no longer just an actress. She was a director, producer, and creative force in her own right. Her directorial debut, Heaven, 1987, was a documentary exploring people's beliefs about the afterlife, a topic both philosophical and oddly whimsical, very much in her style. Later, she directed Unstrung Heroes, 1995, a touching drama about grief, family, and memory, which showcased her talent for storytelling that balanced humor with heart. In 2000, she directed Hanging Up, a bittersweet comedy about three sisters coping with their father's decline, starring Meg Ryan, Lisa Kudrow, and herself. Her direction was introspective and emotional, often exploring themes of loss and connection, echoes of the same emotional truths she once explored alongside Woody. Yet even as their professional worlds diverged, Diane never entirely left Woody's corner. When the scandal surrounding him exploded into public view, most of Hollywood went silent. Many former collaborators refused to speak, and some condemned him outright. But Diane, loyal, reflective, and unwilling to join the chorus of outrage, quietly but firmly stood by him. In interviews, she made her stance clear. "I have nothing but fond memories of Woody. I don't believe the accusations." Her words weren't defiant so much as they were steady, a reflection of the trust that had been built over decades. To her, Woody was still the same complex, brilliant man she'd known since her 20s, imperfect, eccentric, but never cruel. For Woody, Diane's continued friendship was a lifeline during his most turbulent years. He once said that no matter what happened, he could always count on Diane to understand him, not to excuse, but to see. Their bond wasn't about blind loyalty. It was about history, about two people who had shared so much truth that no rumor could rewrite it. They stayed in touch quietly, letters, phone calls, the occasional meeting when they happened to be in the same city. Woody, ever the recluse, remained in New York, writing and directing one film a year with clockwork precision. Diane, now based largely in Los Angeles, lived a full and colorful life, raising adopted children, writing memoirs, collecting art and architecture, and maintaining her reputation as Hollywood's most charming eccentric. But when their paths crossed, the warmth between them was unmistakable. In later interviews, Keaton admitted that no matter how much time passed, she always felt at ease with Woody. "He's like family," she said. "You can go years without seeing family, and when you do, it's like no time has gone by." Their friendship had outlasted love, fame, scandal, and even the shifting tides of public opinion. It was a bond that had been forged not in perfection, but in shared humanity. While the world argued over who Woody Allen really was, Diane Keaton seemed to know the answer better than anyone. To her, he was still the same man who once looked at her across a rehearsal stage and saw a muse, a partner, and perhaps the only person who ever truly understood the comedy and tragedy of his soul. When the news of Diane Keaton's passing rippled across the world, it felt like a curtain closing on one of Hollywood's most defining eras. Tributes poured in, from co-star, directors, and fans who grew up with her voice, her laughter, her gentle defiance of what a leading lady was supposed to be. But amid the flood of grief and nostalgia, one voice had remained silent, the one everyone was waiting to hear. For days, Woody Allen said nothing. No public statement, no social media post, no appearance. And then, quietly, he spoke. His words came through in a rare, subdued interview, part reflection, part confession. At 89, Woody sounded older, softer, the sharp rhythm of his speech slowed by time. But his mind was as precise as ever. "Annie wasn't just a character," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "It was my truth. Diane was my truth." That sentence alone sent a shockwave through film circles. For decades, people had speculated about how much of Annie Hall was autobiographical, how much of Alvy Singer was Woody Allen, and how much of Annie was Diane Keaton. Now, for the first time, he confirmed what everyone had long suspected. The line between art and life had never existed. He went on to explain that even after their romance ended, Diane never really left his creative world. "I kept writing her," he admitted, in one way or another. She was always there, in the dialogue, in the humor, in the kind of woman I imagined my characters falling in love with. She was always a heartbeat. It was a confession, not just nostalgia, but a creative dependency. Even when they hadn't spoken in years, Diane lived in his stories. The graceful, awkward women who challenged cynicism with warmth, who brought sunlight into rooms he'd filled with neurotic shadows. When pressed on whether he regretted how their relationship had ended, Woody hesitated. "Regret?" he said quietly. "I suppose it's not about what happened, but what didn't. We could have lasted longer, maybe forever, if I'd been less me. Fame, insecurity, fear, they get in the way. I always thought too much, analyzed everything until it fell apart. She didn't. She just was. That was her gift." For a man who built a career on irony and detachment, his tone now carried none of it. There was no joke to cushion the ache. He spoke as someone who had finally stopped hiding behind wit. "She understood me before I did," he said simply. "I didn't know who I was then, but she did. She saw it all and never flinched." Those who had known them weren't surprised by the honesty. Their connection had always been rooted in a kind of emotional X-ray. Each could see straight through the other. But hearing Woody acknowledge it so openly, after so many years of silence, gave their story a kind of closure that felt almost cinematic. As the interview spread, fans and critics alike called it the confession we all knew was coming. Articles described it as the ending Annie Hall never gave us. For some, it was bittersweet, The realization that his greatest love story had unfolded not in life, but on film, disguised as comedy. For others, it was the most human thing Woody Allen had ever said. He also shared small, tender details, fragments that revealed how deeply Diane had stayed with him. He said he still kept old letters she'd written, still smiled when he heard her laugh in old interviews. She had this way of laughing that made you feel like the world wasn't as bad as you thought, he said, pausing before adding, I could never write a character that laughed like that. I tried, but only she could do it. In the twilight of his life, Woody's reflections weren't about reputation or legacy. They were about understanding what he'd lost and what he'd been given. Diane made my work better, he said. She made me better. The films, the awards, none of it means anything compared to that. The world, listening, felt the same ache that Annie Hall had left behind nearly 50 years earlier. The ache of two people who found love but couldn't hold on to it, who turned their breakup into art, and who, in doing so, made millions of people feel less alone. Film critics later called Woody's statement a eulogy in disguise, a final act of devotion to the woman who had shaped his art and his heart in equal measure. For decades, Annie Hall had stood as the greatest romantic comedy ever made. Now it stood as something more, a time capsule of truth, sealed by the words of a man finally brave enough to say them out loud. As the world mourned Diane Keaton, Woody Allen's confession became the story that completed theirs. In a way, he had given her the final scene she never got, not one written in dialogue, but in remembrance. It was, as he put it quietly at the end of the interview, the last line of a story I've been writing my whole life. And with that, the love story that began on a Broadway stage in 1972 finally found its closing note. Not in a film, but in a whispered truth, too late to change the past, but just in time to honor it. The story of Diane Keaton and Woody Allen isn't just a story of two people who fell in and out of love. It's the story of how they quietly rewrote Hollywood's understanding of what love even looks like. Before Annie Hall, movie romances were polished, idealized, and safely distant from real life. After Annie Hall, they became messier, more neurotic, more human. The kind of love that fumbles and laughs, that questions itself mid-conversation, that can end without ever truly ending. That was a love Diane and Woody gave to cinema. In many ways, they were both dreamers, but dreamers of different kinds. Woody dreamed in words and ideas, turning anxiety and longing into dialogue. Diane dreamed in gestures, glances, and clothes. She wore her inner life on her sleeve, sometimes literally, in her signature vests and ties. Together, they created a visual and emotional shorthand that filmmakers still chase today. The world saw them bicker and banter, fall apart and reconnect, and realize that love doesn't have to be perfect to be beautiful. It can be awkward, uncertain, and deeply flawed, and still mean everything. Diane Keaton's legacy, though, stretches far beyond her performances. She changed the very idea of a leading lady. Her menswear-inspired wardrobe in Annie Hall, the bowler hats, loose trousers, vests, and wide ties, wasn't costume design. It was her own personal style brought onto the set. That unorthodox decision became iconic overnight. Fashion editors called it the Keaton Revolution. Women saw in her a kind of authenticity rarely allowed in Hollywood. A woman who didn't dress to please anyone, but to express herself. It wasn't about trying to look masculine, she once said. It was about being comfortable in my own skin. That attitude, brave, funny, self-possessed, became part of her screen identity and ultimately her legacy. Woody's films, meanwhile, continue to echo her presence long after she stopped appearing in them. The smart, complicated women of Manhattan, Hannah and her sisters, crimes and misdemeanors, all carried traces of Keaton's rhythm, her humor, her contradictions. Critics often remarked that even when she wasn't there, she was there. His cinematic language, the stammering dialogue, the nervous intimacy, the bittersweet humor, all originated during their creative partnership. Together, they redefined not only romantic comedy, but also the emotional realism of modern cinema. Their influence rippled through generations. Directors like Greta Gerwig, Noah Baumbach, and Richard Linklater have all cited Annie Hall as a major inspiration. Gerwig's Frances Ha and Lady Bird carry Keaton's sense of vulnerability and self-deprecating charm. Baumbach's Marriage Story owes much to Allen's emotional honesty and Keaton's disarming authenticity. Even in the more stylized modern romantic films, you can feel their DNA. The long, unbroken conversations, the city as a character, the humor that hides heartbreak. And beyond the screen, what endured most was the affection, unmistakable, unbreakable, between two people who built a world together through art. In interviews over the years, they spoke of each other with the same mixture of fondness and melancholy that once filled their movies. Woody would say, "She made me laugh harder than anyone else ever could," while Diane would smile and call him the smartest man I've ever met, and also the most hopelessly romantic. There was no bitterness, no regret in their words, only gratitude for what they had shared. Imagine, for a moment, a montage, black and white clips of them in Play Again, Sam, stumbling through an awkward date. In Sleeper, dancing in the future with absurd grace. In Annie Hall, walking down a Manhattan street, laughing at a joke only they understood. Between these moments, you hear fragments of interviews, Diane's soft laugh, Woody's nervous cadence, both of them reminiscing about the other. It's a love story told in fragments, pieces of film, pieces of memory, stitched together by time and art. Their legacy isn't one of perfection or permanence. It's one of humanity. They show that love can outlive romance, that understanding can survive misunderstanding, and that art, when born from truth, can make even the most fragile connection immortal. In the end, Diane Keaton and Woody Allen weren't just actress and director, muse, and maker. They were two dreamers who met in the right place at the right time and turned their lives into stories that would outlast them both. As the years pass, their work continues to remind us that love is not always tidy, that life is not always kind, and that sometimes the greatest art comes from the simple act of seeing another person clearly and being seen in return. Diane once said, "Love is the hardest thing to keep simple." Woody, in his own way, spent a lifetime proving her right.